Imagine waking up on a July morning. You pull back the curtains expecting bright sunshine. Instead, snow is falling. Not in the mountains. Not in the middle of winter. In the middle of summer. Within months, crops across entire countries would fail. Food would become scarce. Families would go hungry. And millions of people would find themselves caught in one of history's strangest climate disasters. The terrifying part? No one knew why. Some believed it was the beginning of the apocalypse. Others thought the sun was dying. But the real cause wasn't in the sky at all. It was hiding nearly 8,000 miles away, inside a mountain that had been silently gathering strength for centuries. This is the incredible true story of the year without a summer. The year the weather seemed to turn against humanity. And it all started with one explosion. In the early 1800s, the Indonesian island of Sumbawa looked like paradise. Dense tropical forests covered the landscape. Fishing villages lined the coast. Fertile farmland stretched across the island. Watching over it all was Mount Tambora. At more than 4,300 meters, around 14,100 feet, it dominated the horizon. To the people living there, it was simply another mountain. No one alive had ever seen it erupt. For centuries, it had remained almost completely silent. But silence can be deceptive. Deep beneath the surface, an enormous chamber of molten rock was slowly expanding. Year after year, pressure continued to build. The mountain wasn't sleeping. It was storing energy, waiting. Then, on April 10, 1815, Mount Tambora finally reached its breaking point. What happened next wasn't just another volcanic eruption. It was one of the most powerful explosions in recorded human history. The blast was heard more than 2,000 kilometers away. On distant islands, British military officers believed they were under attack. Some reportedly ordered soldiers to prepare their cannons, convinced enemy warships had opened fire. The sound they were hearing wasn't a battle. It was a mountain ripping itself apart. Within hours, towering columns of ash blasted more than 40 kilometers into the atmosphere. Day suddenly became night. The sky turned black. Instead of rain, burning rocks and volcanic ash rained down across the island. Then came the deadliest part. Superheated clouds of ash, gas, and shattered rock raced down the mountainside at incredible speed. These pyroclastic flows were hundreds of degrees hot enough to destroy nearly everything in their path. Entire villages disappeared within minutes. For thousands of people, escape wasn't even possible. As if that wasn't enough, the eruption also triggered powerful tsunamis that crashed into nearby coastlines, sweeping away homes, boats, and entire communities. By the time the eruption ended, tens of thousands of people had died. Some were killed instantly. Many more would later die from starvation and disease as the region struggled to recover. When the ash finally settled, the landscape had become almost unrecognizable. The summit of Mount Tambora had vanished. In its place was a colossal crater nearly 6 kilometers wide and over 1 kilometer deep. It looked as though the mountain's peak had simply been erased from the earth. But as catastrophic as the eruption was, Indonesia wasn't the only place about to suffer. Because the lava wasn't Tambora's deadliest weapon. Its most dangerous attack was completely invisible. Millions of tons of sulfur dioxide gas had been blasted high into the stratosphere, the stable layer of the atmosphere far above the clouds. Their powerful winds began carrying those tiny particles around the globe. Within months, they would block sunlight, cool the planet, and transform 1816 into the year that summer simply never arrived. By the spring of 1816, the eruption itself was already over. Mount Tambora had fallen silent. But the planet hadn't. High above the Earth, millions of tiny sulfate particles continued drifting through the stratosphere. Individually, they were almost invisible. Together, they formed a thin global veil. Sunlight that should have warmed the ground was being reflected back into space. It wasn't enough to plunge the world into another ice age. But it was enough to throw the seasons completely out of balance. And for millions of people, the nightmare was only just beginning. In New England, farmers waited for the warmth that always arrived by late spring. Instead, Cold winds swept across their fields. Then, in June, snow began to fall. Not a light dusting, a genuine summer snowfall. Frost covered crops that should have been growing under bright sunshine. Corn withered before it could mature. Vegetables froze in the ground. Fruit trees stopped producing. Many farmers planted their fields again, only to watch a second frost destroy everything they had left. Some planted a third time. They lost that harvest too. For families who depended entirely on those crops, it wasn't just a disappointing season. It was the difference between survival and starvation. Across parts of the United States and Canada, people slaughtered livestock they could no longer afford to feed. Food supplies shrank. Prices climbed higher every week. For ordinary families, bread was becoming a luxury. Across the Atlantic, Europe was facing its own disaster. The skies remained strangely gray. Rain seemed endless. Fields became waterlogged. Grain rotted before it could be harvested. In some regions, the weather changed so suddenly that entire harvests failed within weeks. By the end of the year, food shortages had spread across much of the continent. Markets emptied. Prices soared. The poorest families suffered first. Many sold their belongings simply to buy enough food for another day. Others left their homes entirely, hoping to find work or supplies somewhere else. Instead, they often found thousands of people searching for exactly the same thing. As hunger spread, disease followed. Malnutrition weakened immune systems. Crowded towns became breeding grounds for epidemics. What had started as a volcanic eruption on a distant Indonesian island had now become a global humanitarian crisis. But perhaps the strangest part of all, almost nobody knew why it was happening. Today, if a volcano erupts halfway around the world, satellites track it within minutes. Scientists analyze it almost instantly. News spreads across the internet in seconds. None of that existed in 1816. There were no satellites, no weather models, no global communication networks. People only saw the symptoms. They had no idea where the disease had begun. Rumors spread faster than facts. Some believed God was punishing humanity. Others claimed the strange weather marked the end of the world. There were even theories that the sun itself was slowly dying. Without reliable information, fear filled the gaps. And fear has always had a way of creating its own explanations. Night after night, families wondered whether the warmth would ever return, whether next year's harvest would survive, or whether civilization itself was beginning to collapse. For many people alive in 1816, those questions didn't seem irrational. They seemed completely reasonable, because every day the world looked a little less familiar than the day before. Yet behind all of this chaos, the real cause remained invisible. No armies, no plague, no mysterious force, just billions upon billions of microscopic particles floating silently high above the planet. Tiny enough to escape notice, powerful enough to change the climate of an entire world. So how could something almost impossible to see steal an entire summer? The answer lies in one of nature's most remarkable scientific chain reactions. By the end of 1816, people had seen enough to know something was terribly wrong. Summer had vanished. Harvests had failed. Entire communities had been pushed to the edge of survival. But one question remained unanswered. How could a volcano that erupted thousands of miles away steal an entire season? The answer is stranger than most people imagine. Because Mount Tambora didn't change the climate with lava. It changed it with something almost impossible to see. When the volcano erupted, it blasted an enormous cloud of sulfur dioxide high into the stratosphere, far above the clouds where our everyday weather takes place. There, the gas mixed with tiny droplets of water and transformed into billions of microscopic sulfate aerosols. Imagine placing a gigantic invisible mirror around the planet. Every day, sunlight raced toward Earth, but before all of it could reach the ground, part of that energy bounced harmlessly back into space. The volcano didn't block all of the sun's light. It blocked just enough. And that tiny difference was enough to rewrite history. Temperatures across much of the northern hemisphere dropped by less than 1 degree Celsius on average. That may not sound dramatic, But nature doesn't need a huge change to create a huge disaster. Just a slightly colder growing season, a few unexpected frosts, a few weeks without enough warmth, and entire harvests can disappear. That's exactly what happened in 1816. One invisible layer high above the earth changed the lives of millions below it. Fortunately, the disaster wasn't permanent. Unlike gases that remain in the atmosphere for decades, these volcanic particles slowly settled back to Earth. Month after month, the invisible veil became thinner. By 1817, temperatures were beginning to recover. The skies gradually became clearer. Fields slowly turned green again. And after nearly 2 years of failed harvests, fear and uncertainty, life finally began returning to normal. But the eruption wasn't finished leaving its mark on history, because perhaps its strangest consequence wasn't agricultural. It was literary. During the dark, cold summer of 1816, a group of young writers gathered near Lake Geneva. Forced indoors by relentless storms, they challenged each other to write ghost stories. One of those writers was Mary Shelley. The gloomy weather, strange skies, and eerie atmosphere helped inspire what would become one of the most famous horror novels ever written. Frankenstein, one volcanic eruption, didn't just reshape the climate. It helped shape literature. Even artists noticed something unusual. For months after the eruption, vivid crimson and orange sunsets appeared across parts of the world as tiny volcanic particles scattered sunlight in remarkable ways. Nature had painted the sky itself. You might think a disaster like this belongs only to history. It doesn't. Could another eruption like Tambora happen again? Yes. Not next week. Not necessarily in our lifetime. But someday. Large volcanic eruptions are a natural part of Earth's history, and scientists know they will happen again. The good news is that today we have satellites, seismic monitoring stations, and scientists watching volcanoes around the clock. We would almost certainly know what was happening far sooner than people did in 1816. But knowing about a disaster isn't the same as escaping its consequences. Our modern world is more connected and more dependent on global systems than ever before. A single major eruption could disrupt international flights, damage agriculture, interrupt supply chains, and send food prices soaring across continents. History may not repeat itself in exactly the same way, but it often reminds us how connected our world truly is. The year without a summer wasn't simply a year of strange weather. It was proof that a single event, in one remote corner of the world, could change the lives of people who had never even heard the name Mount Tambora. More than 200 years later, its story still carries a warning. Nature doesn't always announce its greatest threats with earthquakes or towering waves. Sometimes, it changes the world silently. 1 degree, 1 season, 1 harvest at a time. So the next time you step outside on a warm summer afternoon, take a moment to appreciate something most of us never think about. Because in 1816, millions of people stood beneath that same sun and wondered if they would ever feel its warmth again. Pause. If you enjoy uncovering the incredible true stories hidden inside history, consider subscribing for more documentaries where science, history, and human survival come together. Thanks for watching. I'll see you in the next one.